So Steve Borthwick has named his final England squad before naming his World Cup squad on Monday. It's the team to take on Wales this coming weekend. So looking ahead to that, and in particular, looking at what this team selection tells us about Steve Borthwick and what he's thinking in terms of World Cup selection. It's not a team I think anyone really would have predicted, but it is quite intriguing nonetheless. So make sure you drop a comment down below. Let me know what you make of the 23 this weekend and also what you make of how things are maybe shaping up for England ahead of the World Cup. Like the video, subscribe to the channel as well. But let's get into it. So all the different nations are naming their final World Cup squad at different times. England going pretty early on it with only having one warm-up game, then naming the squad. I guess there's two ways to look at that really. Number one would be that it's great because it gives them the rest of their preparation with the squad, with the group of players that are heading to France. The negatives would be that for a lot of players this weekend, this is their only chance in terms of actual game time. I know they've been in camp for quite a while, but in terms of an actual game to stick their hand up for selection, it doesn't give them much time to try and shine. This is the starting team that Steve Borthwick has gone for. I'll get into it in more detail in a moment, but debut for Tom Pearson, potential debuts off the bench for Theo Dan and Tom Willis as well. And just in terms of what I was mentioning there, about the fact that this is the final game for these players to stick their hand up for selection. I'd imagine we're going to see quite a disjointed game for quite a lot of reasons. First of all, if you look at that starting team, not many of those combinations have played together before, with the exception of the 8, 9, 10 in terms of that Harlequins core. Outside of that, there's a lot of players that probably haven't really played together. It's not a squad we've seen together much, so I think it's going to be a bit disjointed. And I think it's going to be tough for those players because on the one hand, it's weird, isn't it? Because they want to have an unbelievable individual game because a lot of them will know that this is their opportunity to try and get themselves to France. So you're almost as concerned about your individual performance in these games as you are about the team performance because frankly, whether they win or not isn't really that big an issue. So I don't know, I always think that adds an interesting layer to these sorts of games and must make it quite difficult to the players. But for me, this team, and I know I've said it already that many people wouldn't have been expecting it, it is, for the most part, all about the positions that Steve Borthwick isn't sure about in his squad at the moment. Because that's the starting team. If I bring up this graphic, those are the players, in my opinion, that aren't guaranteed a place in France. So if I'll start with the ones that are, number one, Ellis Genge, we know that he's going. I think Will Stewart is more than likely going to be going as well, as if not really any other options there in terms of the tight heads that they have in the squad. Danny Care is going to go again, same thing. They've said they're going to take 3 scrum halves and there's only 3 in the squad. I think Marcus Smith actually probably is going to go. That's why there's a question mark after his name. But if they did go with 2 fly halves, I think it would be Owen Farrell and George Ford. Freddie Stewart goes, we all know that. And then a few players on the bench. Carl Sinclair will obviously go. And then Jack Van Portfleet, scrum half, same thing. George Ford, Henry Slade. I think are pretty short of their places. But outside of that, the rest of those names that are up there, I think aren't sure of a place on the plane. So this squad is all about Steve Borthwick giving them an opportunity to stick their hand up for selection, essentially, which is why it makes it pretty intriguing from some of the things that I've mentioned already. I thought the best thing to do maybe would be run through the team and kind of explain where I think this England squad is at the moment and what it means for those players down there below. Let's start in the front row. Obviously, as I say, Ellis Genge is going to go. I think Marla probably goes as well. He's not part of the 23. And then it's possibly going to be Mako, possibly Bevan Rod, who's on the bench. Rapava Ruskin might come back in because Rod and him have swapped over in recent weeks. So there's a place up for grabs there, but Ellis Genge as the starter is already on the plane. I'm pretty sure of that. So maybe Bevan Rod, an opportunity on the bench. Hooker's a funny position for England because Jamie George is vastly more experienced than anyone else in the squad. He's also the best hooker in the squad as well because of the injuries to Luke Cowan-Dickie. So Jamie Blamire and Theo Dan, are they shooting it out this weekend for another spot at hooker? The other curveball to throw in there is Jack Walker. He's been part of the squad fairly consistently, but rehabbing, he's injured, uncertainty there. I don't have a huge preference either Blamire or Theo Dan. I think Theo Dan is hot property at the moment, isn't he, in terms of his performance when he came on early in the Premiership final. He has an all-round game as a hooker, which is almost reminiscent a little bit of Harry Thacker or someone like that. I think the question marks over him at the moment are similar question marks to what have always been for Thacker. And that's just what it does to your front row and your strength of your front row at scrums. by having him in as a slightly smaller body. But in terms of his all-round game, he's really impressive. A lot of Newcastle fans will be saying that Jamie Blamire has been waiting in the wings for an opportunity which is long overdue. And then I mentioned Jack Walker. I think he's probably almost the opposite of Theo Dan in that he just shores up the scrum a little bit more, but he doesn't have the all-round game. But they might end up going for that option. So hooker, there's going to be some movement there, and I think how Theo Dan and Blamire go this weekend going to be pretty intriguing. Tight head, only names in the squad: Cole, Stewart, Sinclair. So they're all on the plane, so no question marks there. Second row is pretty difficult. Atoje, we know, will already go. Ollie Chesham had a good Six Nations. Let's be honest, he was probably one of the only England players to come out of the Six Nations with any credit, really. He actually played pretty well, the second row, but he has been injured. He's been rehabbing, so touch and go. Is he going to be available? If he is, I think he goes. So then is it a shootout if we look at this squad this weekend? Dave Ribbons, George Martin, Johnny Hill on the bench. Those guys vying for places. I mean, they all have good options. They all have good qualities. I really like George Martin. I think he's a bit of a point of difference. Johnny Hill kind of was the guy next to Atoje towards the end of Eddie Jones's time, and then was shifted out. We didn't really see him in the Six Nations, but has had a pretty good season for Sale. So a number of options there. And of course, you've got Courtney Laws, who isn't part of this squad, who will be going to the World Cup, could play on the flank, could possibly play in the second row, although he hasn't played there for quite a long time. Let's get onto the back row, because this, along with the back three, I think is probably the hardest area of the team to pick for England. So just quickly, the guys that aren't there and aren't going to be playing this weekend: Jack Willis, Curry, Laws, who I already mentioned, Vunipola. I would imagine they're all going to go. The first three kind of obviously, really, and just in terms of Willis, Curry, Laws, the quality they bring and the options they bring on the flanks. Vunipola's an intriguing one because he's not going to have played for quite a while because he's been out injured. But you look at the number 8 options for England, and I think Vunipola's the only one really that brings them serious power. The question marks over him are his fitness and how long he can go in a game. Is he going to be able to give you 60, 70, maybe even 80 minutes? I'm not too sure at the moment, which is why I think they probably need another specialist hooker in the squad. I'm just not sure that that's Alex Dombrandt. He gets a go this weekend. I'm really intrigued to see how Tom Willis does off the bench. I'd quite like to, out of those two options, Willis is the one that I'd go for. But as I say, I think you probably need another specialist number 8. Ben Earl, not in this squad as well. What does that tell us? Maybe we can read too much into it, but he's always been a player that has kind of struggled to fit into England squads for some reason, no matter how good he is in the Premiership for Saracens and what a all-court game he kind of has. And the versatility he has on the flank, it just seems like he struggles to fit in. So I'm excited to see Tom Pearson go. I like Lewis Ludlam. I think he's not necessarily the most flashy of the back row options, but is just industrious, incredibly hard-working, very, very good player. And as I said, Dombrandt, haven't been convinced by him and his form for England fairly recently. So those positions in the back row and the combination that Steve Borthwick wants to go for is going to be very interesting indeed. They are, without question, I think, up for grabs this weekend. We've covered 9. There's 3 scrum halves in the squad, so they're going. So there's no real interest there this weekend. 10, Marcus Smith has a question mark there, as I say, is just because he will go, but he'll be the third choice. And I know people are going to be annoyed at that. I think you have to take him because he is a point of difference. But the brutal reality, I think, of Steve Borthwick's era and his style of rugby is George Ford and Owen Farrell are the better options to implement it. And those will be the guys that he calls upon, I would imagine. I don't think we'll see too much of Marcus Smith at a World Cup, apart from maybe against some of those quote-unquote weaker opponents in the pool stages. But I think Marcus Smith goes, so I could probably get rid of his name there. But just a slight question. Into the centres, Guy Porter, Joe Marchant. I think they're playing for spots. I think those are a pretty good example of guys who are good players but aren't certain of a place on the plane. You look at centres, Tuolangi and Lawrence go. Henry Slade goes as well. He's very, very experienced. Elliot Daly, possibly. I mean, he could be back 3. He could be centre. I think that's part of the reason he probably will be on the plane. Interesting that he's not playing here either. So Porter, Marchant, those guys playing for places, maybe in the centres. A couple of spots on the plane. And then the back 3 as well. I said earlier that the back row and back 3 I think are the hardest to call because you've got Freddie Stewart who's nailed on at fullback. Anthony Watson, I think, goes. Henry Arundel, I think, goes. Although, actually, other than that kind of cameo appearance against Australia over a year ago now, he hasn't actually really done anything in an England shirt. And he didn't even have the best of seasons for London Irish. I know he had quite a lot of injuries. He was missing a lot of the time. So you shouldn't hold that against him too much, but I think it's a fair point. I don't think he's done a huge amount, but he is probably a point of difference for England just in terms of the pace and explosiveness that he brings. And then Elliot Daly, I've mentioned already, versatile. And then the guys this weekend, Thokonasinga, Max Malins. Thokonasinga is intriguing because I don't think he's ever really played that well for England. And again, he's another guy that has had an awful lot of injuries, probably hasn't progressed in his career in the way that he would want to, or many people, Bath fans, etc., expected him to. But I can just see Steve Borthwick using him in a similar way to kind of how Leicester would have Nemani Nandolo on one wing, having that big winger who does have a USP in terms of size on one wing, and then maybe a slighter, quicker winger on the other wing, possibly, I don't know. And then Max Malins is another interesting one, because actually he's someone that I don't really think has put much of a foot wrong for England. But out of the options in a back three, and you think of some of the most explosive, exciting wingers in the world and guys that get you out of your seat, Max Malins isn't that. And that's not an insult, because he's just really consistent. He scores tries, he does everything well, but maybe doesn't have that kind of utterly blistering pace or ridiculous footwork that people love to see in their wingers. And he had a good Six Nations as well, Max Malins. So maybe he does go. I think he could be on the plane, but he might be one of those that misses out and is unlucky to miss out just because, I don't know, they have other options. He hasn't really done anything wrong. So I feel like that's kind of where this squad is at the moment. That's why, for me, this squad is all about finding combinations ahead of the World Cup. I just kind of feel sorry for those players because, as I say, I think it's going to be pretty tough to. It's going to be pretty tough to stand out in a team of a lot of people who are just trying to have really good individual performances. And how much of it is going to come down to the training pitch as well? How much of selection is going to be down to the fact that Steve Borthwick has had these guys in camp for quite a few months now? So he knows them pretty well by this point. How much does it come down to this game or training? All those things are always intriguing. We end up second-guessing ourselves. But this squad by Steve Borthwick, it's all about the World Cup and working out those fringe places. In my opinion, if you disagree, you can drop a comment down below and let me know. Let me know what you make of the squad and some of the things I've gone through as well in the video in terms of who is guaranteed, I think, already a place in France and who isn't, who's fighting for their spots. So, yeah, you can let me know. Subscribe to the channel, like the video as well, and I'll see you in the next one.